Variables are known as either global variables or local variables. Global variables are declared at the top of a class outside of the main or another named block of code, while local variables can only be used inside the main or named block of code itself. So right now, my cursor is inside the main block of code, so I can create local variables for this program. I've named the program rectangle perimeter, and where I'm going to actually calculate the perimeter of a rectangle and output that to the screen. So I'm going to create two variables inside the main, which are going to represent my width and length of rectangle. So int, and then using camel case, I can do the rectangle width, which I'm then going to set as a value for, which we'll talk about how to set the values in the next video. I'm also going to set up another variable that's also type int, but represents the length of my rectangle. Okay. And I can change these values to whatever I want them to be, as long as they're an int value. So there's no numbers after the decimal, and they're only a number. Now, I want to be able to calculate my perimeter and store that value into another variable, which I'm going to create a global variable for this purpose, something that could be used in more than one block of code. So right now I'm only working in the main block of code, but later on we're going to look at how to set up other blocks of code that may also need to use the same variable as this main block of code. If we go back to the top of the class, and I create some space in here for another variable, making a variable here would set it as a global variable. Now I use the keyword static so that it can be used inside the main block of code, which is also declared as static. Otherwise, I won't be able to use it inside that block. I'm going to set it as a type int, and then this variable I'm going to use to actually calculate the perimeter of my rectangle. Maybe I'm doing something much larger where I need to use that perimeter in multiple blocks of code. That would be when I want to use a global variable. So let's set it as rectangle perimeter. And that's going to be a type int as well. So I'm storing the calculation of using the width and the length into my variable rectangle perimeter. Okay, so I start by using that variable as well. So this is what's known as an assignment. So I'm taking the variable rectangle perimeter, which right now is a global, and I'm going to store some information into that variable. So I've declared it at the top, and now I want to do the calculation with the width and the length and put that value inside the rectangle perimeter box in memory. So I take 2 times the width and add 2 times the length. That's the calculation for perimeter of a rectangle. That will then store that calculation into that variable, rectangle perimeter. And we'll talk about that when we look at assignment in more detail. I want to output that information to the screen. So using our output, and we put in a nice descriptive sentence that tells the user what was calculated and what the values are. So the perimeter of a rectangle with a width of, and then I can use concatenation to put the values of those variables in there. Now, in order to output the value, you need to make sure that the identifier is not inside the quotation marks. So I've ended the quotation marks, and now I'm concatenating the rectangle width, and then I'm going to continue my sentence, and a length of, and then concatenate the rectangle length, and again continue my sentence again, is equal to, and then the value of rectangle perimeter, and end my sentence with a period. Okay, close off the bracket, end with a semicolon, done. Okay, so this will output that sentence with the values of the variables that I've stored either when I've declared the actual variables or at a later time when I'm assigning this value of this calculation to this variable here. I run the program. I have an output down here. So the perimeter of a rectangle with 4, so it's only giving me the value, not the actual identifier name. And a length of 13 is equal to 34. Now the use of a global variable was not necessary in this example. I could have used this variable inside the main block of code. Since I'm not using it anywhere else, it makes more sense to put it there. Okay, so local variables should be used as good programming style, which improves your memory usage, but occasionally it may be necessary to use global variables depending on your application. So when we start getting into building games and that sort of thing, larger programs, then it makes sense to start using global variables and only for things that you absolutely need to use in more than one block of code. Okay, so, and what's happening in here, why these are called local variables, so these will be declared inside the main. At the end of the main, those variables are no longer accessed by the program. So at the end here, they're no longer being used. So outside of this curly brace, those two variables are not accessible by the program, but the global variable is. Okay, so either accessible by that program or for other blocks of code.